Eddie, could you be so kind to introduce our speaker tonight?
Yes, thank you. The speaker tonight is someone I've known since 1985. And we've worked together twice, just twice, right, Craig?
I think so.
In Pensacola at the newspaper there, and then again in Sarasota. I'm going to read you what I've been given, and don't blush, Craig. This is okay. He's a native Floridian, an author, a podcaster, an award-winning environmental reporter. He was born in Pensacola. He graduated from Troy State University in Alabama, where his muckraking work for the student paper prompted an agitated dean to label him, quote, the most destructive force on campus. And I got to tell you, he has struggled to maintain that his whole life.
I don't think he meant it as a compliment either.
After 31 years at the Tampa Bay Times, he now writes a weekly column for the Florida Phoenix and co-host of the popular podcast, Welcome to Florida. He's the author of 6 nonfiction books about Florida, including the New York Times bestseller, Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country, and Cattail, The Wild, Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther, which Garden and Gun magazine named one of the 20 best books of 2020. His most recent one, which you all will now go out and buy. His most recent one was published in September. It's The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife. I gotta tell you on a personal note, I went to work in Pensacola without ever having met anybody there. I mean, they hired me over the phone, okay? My wife and I both, they hired us over the phone. There, I learned that Craig was one of the hardest working, one of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. And again, when I worked with him the second time, the same thing. Craig can tell you the most hard-edged story and still leave you with a smile on your face. So please, let's welcome my friend and a really great Florida journalist, Craig Pittman.
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks. Send me your bill for how much you're charging me for that, okay?
Oh, I thought you'd already paid that.
Hi, y'all. How are you doing tonight? My name's Craig Pittman. I write for the Florida Phoenix once a week, and I also do some other things like the podcast that Eddie mentioned, Welcome to Florida, where our concept is 900 new people move to Florida every day, and nobody tells them what they've gotten themselves into. So we're trying to fill that niche. I wanted to talk to y'all tonight about the book that Eddie mentioned, Cattail, which came out in 2020 in hardback and then in paperback last year. It was a real labor of love, emphasis on the labor part. Because every time I would write about a story at the Times about trying to save the Florida Panther, I'd think, man, this would make a great book because the characters are really interesting and unusual. The plot takes all kinds of twists and turns you don't see coming, but it didn't have an ending, and I needed an ending. So finally, about 5 years ago, I saw something happen that I thought would make a really good ending, and I wrote the book, and it came out. And so the book starts out with this, what I at first thought was a statue standing in Tallahassee outside the state archives in the R.A. Gray building. And I thought, boy, that's a kind of a cheap, amateurish looking statue. Well, it turned out it wasn't a statue at all. It was actually a real panther that had been stuffed and mounted there. And it turned out to be the most important panther in Florida history, Florida Panther number 3, whose death actually sort of changed everything for the panther and in effect led to the things that wound up sort of saving the species. The early inhabitants of Florida were, they actually worshiped the panthers. They called it the cat of God. the Spaniards who landed here didn't know what to make of them. There had been a panther species in Europe, but it had gone extinct by the time they had come around. So they didn't know what these things were. They called them lions. The early settlers were petrified of the cats. They called them lions or cougars or catamounts, which, by the way, is a great word. I think we should bring that one back. And they were afraid that the panther would eat their cows and their other livestock and their children and just be a disaster for them. So they shot them every time they got a chance. And so many people shot panthers that by 1958, the State Game Commission, as it was then known, told everybody, stop shooting panthers. They're off limits now. We don't have enough that we can spare. So the only place you could find them was at roadside zoos, and including one in Bonita Springs called the Everglades Winter Gardens. It was run by Lester and Bill Piper, who were former bootleggers from Michigan. They had decided to move to Florida because things got a little hot for them up in Detroit. So they moved south and opened up this little roadside zoo, the Everglades Winter Gardens, for people coming across the Tamiami Trail. And they exhibited snakes and alligators and bears, and they had panthers too. And at one point, Everglades National Park ran out of panthers. So many panthers had been killed that they just didn't have any more. They called the Piper brothers up and said, can you bring us some panthers? And they said, sure, no problem. So they trucked some over to the Everglades and turned them loose, which ended up becoming a fairly significant development. So when the Endangered Species Act passed in the early 70s, the panthers were on that original endangered species list, along with manatees and key deer and alligators. Alligators, believe it or not, used to be considered endangered. So, well, that's the other picture, but I'll get to that in a minute. So a lot of smart people thought that the panther was gone. The state officials said, you're wasting your time putting them on the endangered list. There are no panthers left. And the World Wildlife Fund actually went to Texas and hired a guy named Roy McBride, an experienced hunter, to come to Florida and see if he could find any panthers left. And so Roy searched around, he turned his dogs loose, he hunted around and finally found one very scrawny female near Lake Okeechobee. And he found signs that there were others, not a lot, but there were a few. So the state said, well, I guess we better pick somebody to work on protecting them. So they hired a guy named Chris Belden, who was a large mammal biologist, but he had never seen a panther before, much less studied them. And so he did two things. He was very methodical. One of the things he did was he went to Roy McBride and said, teach me to track panthers. And so he trained with Roy on how to look for signs of panthers in the landscape. And then he went around the state looking for reports of panthers and giving speeches about them to various facilities and writing up stories about them. And every time there would be a story about a panther, about Chris Belden looking for panthers, there would be pictures of them in the paper, pictures of these very sleek looking animals. And people sort of caught this in their imagination. And in 1981, the guy who was then the Secretary of Education for Florida, Ralph Turlington, sent out ballots to all the school systems and said, yeah, okay, there's Florida Panther number 3. That's what I thought was a statue, and it's actually a real panther that was stuffed and mounted in Tallahassee. So he sent this ballot around for people to vote for the kids to vote on what would become the state animal. And he gave them the choices of an alligator, a manatee, dolphins, and he put panther on there. And the Panthers won by an overwhelming margin because so many people had been so taken by Chris Belden's quest to find panthers. And the following year, the legislature was supposed to ratify that choice. But some of the legislators said, well, no, that's stupid. Everybody knows the gator's supposed to be the state animal. And they were bombarded with letters and phone calls from parents and kids saying, don't you try and overturn what the kids did, make the panther the state animal. So the panther became the state animal. And as a result, got a lot of increased attention because can you imagine what would happen if panthers went extinct, after becoming the state animal? It would be like picking a Lamborghini as the governor's official sports car and having it stolen. So they started putting collars on the panthers, started tracking them down. They found out that there were only a few of them left, and they were down in sort of the area of the Big Cypress Preserve. So they brought in Roy and his dogs, and they started tracking them down and putting radio collars on them so they could follow them and see where they went and what they ate and that kind of thing. And that was the way they would learn about them. And they'd been doing this a couple of years, and each time they would capture one, they would give it a number according to which one it was. And they had gone around to like 5 or 6 by now, but the battery on Florida Panther number 3, its collar was starting to go bad. So they had to recapture that one. And when they did, they shot it, they treated it, they shot it with a tranquilizer dart, and the panther fell out of the tree and it was bleeding. And they said, "Oh my God, have we killed it?" And a couple of the people involved rushed in. One of them, a woman named Deborah Jansen, gave the dying panther mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which I think is a commitment to the job you seldom see in America these days. But they were unable to save it, and Chris Belden actually carried the carcass of that panther out of the swamp on his shoulders, and it felt like he was carrying the weight of the extinction of the whole species on his back. And sure enough, there was a huge furor, and yeah, a lot of people turned against panther science. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, of all people, said, "Leave those poor panthers alone, let them die in peace." And so Belden was removed from supervising the capture team. They brought in somebody else. But most importantly, they hired a veterinarian to accompany the capture team going out to catch these panthers. And her name was Melody Relke. And she came in and she had her own agenda. She was already looking for something you would normally see in a small population, which was genetic defects. She said, I'm pretty sure these things are probably inbreeding, and as a result, there are genetic defects. And when she started looking for them, she found them. But she had a hard time convincing her bosses. She was a woman in this male-dominated field, and they said, no, it's the loss of habitat. That's the big problem. But finally, she proved it to them, because one of the defects was a kink in the tail of the panther. I mean, like a 90-degree angle, like you'd see in a math textbook. And when they went to the Everglades to capture panthers there for the first time, the panthers there that were descendants of those cats from the Everglades Wonder Gardens, they had no kink in their tail. Their genetic differences were very distinct. And suddenly they said, "Wait a minute, maybe Melody's right. Maybe there are genetic defects." And in fact, by then she'd found even worse ones, where there was a hole in their heart called an atrial septal defect, or with the males, sometimes the testicles had not descended, which meant they couldn't breed at all. And so basically the panther population was circling the drain. So the immediate reaction from the Game Commission was, "Oh my God, we've got to capture every single panther left in the wild and start captive breeding." And an animal activist from Gainesville sued and said, "You can't take every single panther out of the wild. That's crazy." So they worked out a settlement where they would only capture kittens. They'd capture a certain number of kittens to start a captive breeding program. There was only one problem. Every kitten they captured had the same genetic defects, so they couldn't do a captive breeding program. And so they were just despairing. They said, "What are we going to do now?" So finally, they decided to try something that had never been tried before. They were going to do what they called genetic augmentation. They sent Roy out to Texas to capture 8 female cougars from the population there and bring them to Florida and turn them loose. And I have to tell you, this is the part of the book where things look their darkest, but also it's the funniest chapter in the book, because Roy's story of how he goes out to get these cougars and bring them back to Florida was absolutely hilarious. I'll just say the words "blindfolded mule" and leave it at that. Okay. So Roy brings them back here, and they are turned loose. And while that's going on, while the state is doing its best to save the panther, to save the state animal, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, meanwhile, was handing away every single piece of panther habitat it could to developers. That included the building of Florida Gulf Coast University in the middle of panther habitat, all kinds of development around that. Fort Myers Airport was developed panther habitat. I mean, basically, every chance they got, they said yes to an application from a developer to build there. And some of the biologists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service objected and were told by their bosses in Atlanta, "Florida will be developed. So, basically don't bother us with your objections." Finally, a whistleblower stood up and said, "I can't do this anymore." And he actually sued his own agency to make them stop doing this because they were using junk science to approve these things. And his name is Andy Eller. Ultimately, he won the case, but lost his job, but figures it was all worthwhile. And so I don't want to give away too much of the ending, but we now have about 200 panthers stalking around in what's left of the wilderness here in Florida. So they're doing better than they were. In 1995, there were only about 30. So we've definitely come a long way. They're not out of the woods, pardon the pun, but they're doing better than they were. And every chance I get, I try and tell people this story to show that there are good news stories on the environment in Florida, you know, but it takes a lot of will, it takes a lot of ingenuity for this to happen. And the fight's not over. There are still fights going on over the loss of panther habitat and over trying to maintain the state animal as our state animal and not let them be wiped out. Because as long as we've got panthers, we've still got wilderness here in Florida. You guys have any questions?
First of all, thank you for the great talk, and I apologize for fumbling with the pictures.
It's okay. It's okay. That one picture of the capture, that was Roy McBride in the cowboy hat, and the woman who was looking at the camera, that was Deborah Jansen, the one who actually gave
All right. I'll go ahead and
mouth-to-mouth resuscitation at the.
I'll put that up for
and Deborah, by the way, that was in 1981. That was the first panther capture, and yeah, that's her smiling at the camera because she really wasn't supposed to be there. She kind of snuck in. She's still working with panthers today. She's employed by the National Park Service at the Big Cypress Preserve and still doing panther science today. And Roy, who wore that white cowboy hat every time I saw him, he doing everything he was doing wearing that white cowboy hat, is now training his grandson to replace him. His grandson's name is Cougar. And when I kind of raised an eyebrow at that, Roy said, I didn't name him. There's a lot I'm omitting from the story because I want you to go read it. But I will mention that the skunk ape makes a cameo in the story, and there's also a thing in there about how they built the first underpass so that the panthers could go under the road instead of trying to cross it and get hit by cars. And the DOT was convinced this would not work. The engineers said, no way, you're not going to get panthers under there. So they put a camera under there with a motion sensor. And sure enough, that camera showed that it was being used by not just panthers, but also bears, foxes, raccoons, and a guy in an ape suit. What he was doing under there, nobody knows.
Okay, so first question we have here is the Florida Republican Party years ago was the environmental party. For instance, legendary conservationist Nat Reed, who was a co-author of the Endangered Species Act. Now it's anti-science and often a climate change denying party. What happened?
Reagan. I mean, and you can see the change right there. Nixon started the EPA. Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act that, as you mentioned, a Florida man, Nat Reed, co-wrote. You know, that was a cause for them for so long. And then when Reagan came in, Reagan was all about business and it was all about the economy and the heck with that other stuff. I wrote an earlier book called Paving Paradise, which is about the loss of wetlands in Florida. The Jacksonville office of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers originally was one that was rejecting a majority of the applications to destroy wetlands in Florida. And when Reagan came in, the guy he put in charge of the Corps of Engineers came to Jacksonville and told him, get your rubber stamps out. I mean, it was just that flat out. And so now they approve something like 85 to 90% of all their permits that come in. And they say that's what we're supposed to do. That's the way we're supposed to do it. It's just astonishing. And Reagan was where that change happened. And it's been continued since then. Occasionally you'll have a Republican who pop up who actually does care about the environment. Charlie Crist, when he was governor, actually did several good things for the environment, much to everyone's surprise, and was interested in climate change and other stuff like that. Jeb Bush, for all his many faults, actually did start a Florida Springs initiative to save the springs. But when Rick Scott came in, once again, it was like Reagan again. It was all about the jobs, all about business. Basically, any polluting industry that was having trouble meeting the guidelines for clean waters, the DEP was told, help them to make it on paper, help them to come into compliance on paper. And so that became the policy of, we don't fine anybody, we don't sue anybody, we don't penalize anybody, we help them make it look okay on paper. And that's, that's sort of been the mindset.
All right, thank you. The next question is, what are the chances the final Roads to Ruin project will be stopped?
That's a good question. So yeah, we had the 3 roads to ruin that the former Senate President Bill Galvano came up with after meeting with the Florida Road Builders Association. Gee, what a shock! And they gave him a pretty hefty campaign contribution. And the legislature passed it, and the governor signed it, saying, well, everybody needs roads, which, and the people who were in the path of these roads all set up a big howl of protest. And several places like Levy County actually said, we don't want your roads here, go away. And so finally, the legislature repealed 2 of them. The one that was going to go through panther habitat, which used to be the Heartland Parkway, and then another one that was going to be part of the Suncoast. But now they've got this one left called the Northern Turnpike Extension that's still on the books that the repeal didn't touch. And once again, people in Levy County and the other rural counties are saying, you didn't hear us the first time. We don't want it here. We like our rural lifestyle. We moved here for that reason, or else we stay here for that reason. And the DOT is pushing forward with it anyway. So we'll see what happens. It's an election year. This is a good year to get the ear of your legislator and tell them, I don't like this. But at least that's been the case in the past. This year, they've been all about the culture war stuff. So they're not doing the stuff you would expect them to tackle. They left on the table all kinds of big issues that they just didn't even touch because they were in service to someone's presidential ambitions.
So Florida Veterans for Common Sense is working to establish the electricity portfolio standard for Florida with an emphasis on renewables. What are the best, easiest ways to go about it? Should we go the legislation route, a constitutional amendment, or both?
I'd do a constitutional amendment because the legislature just is not listening to people these days. It really is not. And the constitutional amendment really has gotten their attention. You can tell because every time they get a chance, they try and make it harder to pass a constitutional amendment. So I think that's your way to go. I'm no expert, but they passed that anti-net metering bill at the behest of Florida Power and Light, which wrote the bill. So that tells you who they're listening to.
All right, thank you. The next question is, can a small nonpartisan group like ours have an impact? What is the best way to go about it?
Yes, absolutely. Let me tell you a story. But there was a time when they were planning to build the largest jet port in the world in what was left of panther habitat, in what was called the Big Cypress Preserve. And there was a guy named Joe Browder who was trying to arrange for people to oppose this because it was the headwaters of the Everglades. And how awful would it be if you screwed up the Everglades after preserving it? So he went to see this woman who'd written a book about the Everglades, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And he said, Marjorie, we want to help you. We want your help in trying to combat this jet port. And we've got Nat Reed on our side. We've got a whole bunch of other people on our side. And she said, I'm just an old lady. Nobody listens to me. People listen to groups. And he said, fine, let's start a group. And so together they started Friends of the Everglades with dues of $1 a year. And they had maybe 10 people to start with. And they stopped the jet port. And Marjorie continued being an advocate for the environment for the next 30 years. She died when she was 108. So, starting when you're 78 and becoming an advocate, clearly not too late to get started on that stuff. And a little group can have a big voice.
All right. Thank you for the encouraging words. Let's see here. We have a question from one of our viewers, from Bill Maturo. He wants to know, were you at Troy State when my wife's father was the head of the journalism department there?
Was that John Hamner? Because the answer is no.
I don't know.
Okay.
He didn't say in the question. Have to wait.
The dean that told me I was the most destructive force on campus was Merrill Bankster, who didn't think he'd spent his entire career in Alabama. So, and was worried that we were going to end it with the student newspaper.
All right. I'd encourage all the other listeners. We have one more question here, but please put some more questions here. We have some time in the Q&A here. The last question we have is, how can DeSantis and his corporate cronyism be stopped?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I think the biggest thing you can do is expose them, expose what's going on, expose how he is sort of beholden to these big companies. I mean, I've written about how he's been doing big sugar's will, even though he styled himself as an enemy of sugar. He's certainly, been kowtowing to lots of other big corporations. He was doing Disney's bidding until they crossed him. And I got a good laugh last week when I think it was the Miami Herald did a story about how he was criticizing a piece of legislation that gave Disney a big break legally, except that it turns out his own staff had written the break into the law. So, I think that's anytime you can point that out and remind people of that, anytime someone tells you, oh, he's the greatest governor Florida's ever had, and you can say, well, maybe not. Let me tell you about some things. Just try and inform the public as much as you can and show them, what you see on Fox is not reality. Fox is not, Fox is in love with Ron DeSantis, but I'm not sure the rest of Florida should be. And I make that argument strictly on the competency basis, because he got everything he wanted out of the legislature, and most of what the legislature did had no content to help people with their everyday problems. We've still got a property insurance crisis. We got a car insurance crisis. They didn't do anything to fix the condo inspection problem we've got that was exposed by the Surfside condo collapse. Manatees are still starving, and they haven't fixed the pollution laws. I mean, it's just a range of stuff. The affordable housing is still in crisis. These are all things that affect real people, and not, what are they teaching our kids in school, is just silly stuff. So in comparison to, will I still have a place to live, and will the building I live in fall down around me? That's just, that seems a little more important and a little more urgent, and they're not tackling that. So
I have a question. I've been a Florida resident now for almost 5 years, and
congratulations, you made the right choice.
Thank you. And about maybe 2-3 times over that period, somebody's posted on Next Door Neighbor, or there's been a panther sighting and stuff. And I live down in Palmer Ranch, and there's some little bit of preserve around us and stuff, in South Creek and whatever. So with only 250 panthers kind of in the state, does that seem reasonable? Or
it's possible. Let me put it that way. It's possible. There was a verified panther sighting in the Carlton Preserve a few years ago. So, and there was one there, and it actually hung around for a while. The male panthers are pretty wide ranging. One of them left Southwest Florida and roamed all the way up north to Georgia before a deer hunter freaked out and shot it. So they will go a long way, looking for food and looking for love if it's mating season. So it's possible. More often, what people see and think as a panther is actually a bobcat or a very large dog. Those have both been confused for panthers in the past. So, but if you see one, report it to the FWC, and they'll send a biologist out to check for prints and other signs.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's what I suspected.
I hate to be the cynic. Well, I don't either. I've always been a cynic.
No, you don't.
But I am really discouraged as far as what can be done when you're talking about the way politics or works now, because what you and other reporters used to have to do would go and find out what was going on. I mean, the dark alleys and the conversations and the phone calls. Now, the stuff they used to do in secret, they do right on the floor. I
Yeah.
mean, right out in the open. And
Some
I
of
don't
it.
know.
Some of it, not all of it.
Well, you see, I don't know what have they done in secret that I don't know about. I mean, I just don't see that much. I'm like I say, I'm being cynical, but I realize.
There's a reporter named Jason Garcia. He worked for the Orlando Sentinel for a while, and before that for Florida Trend. He now puts out his own newsletter called Seeking Rents, where he has been digging into all the secret deals that the legislature has made with various corporations just this year. And it's been outstanding reporting. He had a piece today in his newsletter about how the legislature, in a last minute deal, had slipped in some language to give more money from the Florida lottery sales back to the companies that sell the tickets, like 7-Eleven and so forth, and less to the educational system. And remember, that was the whole point of the lottery, was to, to help fund the educational system. No, they're going to take it away from the kids and give it to the big corporations. But, we're worried about the kids and what their teachers are telling them, so that tells you what's really going on there.
So we have a few more questions that have come in. This one I think you'll like a lot, from Philippe Koenig. He wants to know, which of your books should we read and in what order and why?
Ooh, okay. So if you're interested in the environment, I would recommend Cattail. I think it's my best book on an environmental issue. And if you're interested in Florida as a whole, then I recommend Florida, the How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country, which made the New York Times bestseller list for all of a week, which meant that they could put that little sticker on the paperback version when it came out saying New York Times bestseller. I wrote up a book proposal for that in 2014, and my agent sent it around to different places because we thought 2016 would be a great year to have a book come out about Florida, because, every 4 years, the rest of the country kind of gives Florida the side eye about how are we going to screw up the election this time. And 15 publishers in New York said, this is a stupid idea and don't bother us. And one of them, St. Martin, said, yes, we think this is great and we'll put it out. And they put it out in 2016, and it got rave reviews in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and Washington Post. Sold obviously really well. And in fact, I'm still getting royalty checks from a book that came out, 6 years ago. And won a gold medal from the Florida Book Awards, which I wore around my neck like a rap star for about a week. So that one turned out pretty well. And it tells you a lot of Florida history and culture, but kind of sneaks it in a kind of subtle way by giving you lots of funny Florida man stories too. So I call it the spoonful of sugar method for teaching you Florida history and culture. So.
All right, great. The next is from Cody Keller, the chair of our environmental working group. And he wants to know, is there anything we can do to help the legislature recognize or admit what we all know, that global warming is caused by humans?
Okay, so that's a good question. Here's what's going on now. Under Rick Scott, you couldn't even say the term climate change. He didn't want to hear it. He'd be like, la, 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 la. Under DeSantis, now they're willing to talk about climate change, but only in a certain way. And that is, they'll use the term resiliency. We need to promote resiliency. DeSantis won't say the words climate change. What he'll say is, we have a very stormy state, which is, come on. But some members of the legislature will say, yes, we're really working on climate change issues because we're coming up with lots of money for resiliency. What that means is we're spending money on seawalls and pumps and raising roads, but we're not going to do anything about the causes of climate change. We're not going to do anything to lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. We're not going to create new building standards. So we're not building with materials that will cause problems, cause more greenhouse gases. We're not going to switch to an electric fleet for the state. We're not going to do all of those things. We're going to build more roads so people have to drive more and create more, carbon pollution in the atmosphere. So in one of my columns, I compared it to filling the same pothole over and over and over again, but never coming out and fixing the road. And that's what they're doing. They're all in favor of filling the pothole. They don't want to do anything to fix the road. And in fact, the governor referred to that as left-wing stuff. We're not going to do any left-wing stuff, he said, meaning he was willing to protect the oil companies that actually left oil on the beaches of Florida because he thinks only left-wingers would want to limit our dependence on fossil fuels. So when you talk to your legislator, and I strongly encourage you to do so, don't get thrown off by them saying, yes, we need to spend more on resiliency, which of course means we need to give more government contracts to big companies to build things, which the legislature loves to do, but instead challenge them to actually do something that stops climate change and stops sea level rise, because we're actually seeing sea level rise in our streets now. You know, there was a place in the Keys, I wrote a column about it, where they had water in their streets for 90 days straight, and people were kind of stranded in there. And that's sea level rise happening right before our eyes, and they're not doing anything about it. They're happy to spend money. They don't want to pass any regulations.
All right, we have a question from Rana Bazzini, and she says, of all the things you've mentioned that are not being addressed, we may have reached a tipping point, or do you think people are paying attention?
I think more Floridians are paying attention to the environment, period, in that they realize now that if the environment and the economy are tied together in Florida, if you screw up the economy, you're going to screw up the environment. We definitely learned that lesson when we had that big red tide outbreak that lasted for, what was it, 19 months straight, and eventually touched on all three of our coasts. So people are paying attention to environmental issues now, but I'm not sure they're quite as attuned to the sort of three-card money that the legislature is playing with this stuff, where they're willing to spend money on symptoms but not do anything about the causes of the things that are problems. So they're spending money on manatee rescue and rehabilitation, but they're not doing anything to fix the pollution laws that led to the algae outbreaks that killed off the seagrass, and that's why the manatees are starving. You see, that's sort of the disconnect there. They're willing to spend money, they don't want to fix the cause. So that's sort of the dilemma we're in. So try and get their attention to that. That's that's my strong recommendation to you. You know, if they have a district meeting where you actually get to meet with them in person, or even if they have a Zoom thing, bring that up and say, why aren't you fixing it? Why aren't you doing your job that we pay you to do? You know, it's not like they're doing this stuff for free. They're taking our taxpayer money and they're spending it, but they're not necessarily spending it in a smart way.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have for now. So I guess I'll turn it back over to Gene.
Before you go, let me just make one comment. And that is, if you're interested in buying a copy of Cattail or Oh Florida, or my more recent book, The State You're In, let me strongly recommend you order it from Tombolo Books here in St. Pete if you want an autographed copy, because I go by there every 2 weeks and sign books for them. So they've got autographed copies. And the name again is Tombolo, TOMBOLO Books. Or if you want to shop local, there in Sarasota, Bookstore One. I go by there and from time to time and sign whatever they have in stock too. And I also put out a weekly newsletter called Oh Florida, the newsletter. If you send me your email address and your name, I will add you to the subscriber list. And it comes out every week and includes a countdown of the top 5 Oh Florida stories of the week. The one this past Sunday, the #1 story was they pulled a guy over in Collier County because they recognized him. They knew he was driving on a suspended license, and they found drugs, they found guns, and in the bed of the pickup truck, there was an alligator. Which I think that's the Florida man trifecta right there.
That is the Florida man trifecta. With that note, we'll make a deal with you. We'll subscribe to your newsletter if you subscribe to ours.
Okay,
so,
that sounds fair.
So we'll exchange emails and do that. And again, I want to thank you for stepping in at the last minute.
My pleasure.
I know that's not easy to do, but it's very appreciated. And I think particularly people that haven't lived in Florida a long time, like some of us natives, really appreciate some of your comments, because it's just astounding. Sometimes I mentioned that I really made progress working with Republicans on important environmental issues, several years ago, and people look at me like I'm absolutely crazy. That can't be true, but that's how Florida has changed over the years. So let's all be optimistic that we can change it back.
There you go. Well, at least now the politicians care enough to pay lip service to the idea.
Well, that's at least something for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you very much. And with that note, unless there's further announcements or anything else from our panelists, we'll sign off.
I do have one more question here that just came in. It's from Robert Kurtz. He wants to know, do we have any up and rising politicians we should look to support?
Oh gosh. Anna Escamami seems really attuned to what's going on with the environment. And Kathy Castor from Tampa, she's in Congress and she is chairing the climate change committee there. So those are two women that I think you would bear keeping an eye on. They seem to be interested in the environment and actually dealing with causes and not just symptoms.
I appreciate those comments very much, because we have a request out right now to Anna Escamani
to
be our speaker. So we'll look forward to that.
Great.
So with that, thank you again. We appreciate it very much. Terrific talk, and please stay involved with us.
Okay, we'll do.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, Craig.
Bye.